So, as I say, I just want to quickly go through some of the things to do with the United Nations Ocean Decade. For the most part, this is going to be sort of fairly dry text telling you about things. So if anybody has a question, please raise your hand or just sort of open the mic and ask away. So for those of you who aren't that familiar with the decade already, this is a United Nations UNESCO activity running from now until, well, 2030. The strapline is the science we need for the ocean we want. And there's a lot of it in terms of focusing on a sustainable approach to the oceans over that period. In terms of structure, you have sort of an umbrella provided by the IOC, effectively, it's sort of the Ocean Decade. And then there are a variety of what they're calling activities. So some of those are labeled as contributions. And so, you know, good examples of that already are the PACE satellite that NASA are putting up and the BGC Argo array are both being put forward as contributions to the decade. There are also activities being done by entities that already exist within the United Nations. So, for example, Goose has a number of activities lined up for the next 10 years. And then there are what they're calling programs. So these are sort of solicited activities, and programs, typically they're looking for things which are at least international, if not global in scope, focusing on particular aspects of the ocean. And so JETZON has been chosen as one of those. And then the idea is that within those programs, they will have a suite of projects, and those might be more local, they might be more focused, but they will sit within these larger programs. And so this is sort of just an overall structure for how the decade will sort of be coordinated. So one question that you might have is, how will JETZON change? The simple answer is it won't. They liked what we're doing, and so effectively they would just like to see more of it. You know, they in particular like the fact that we already have a large number of projects involved. That those projects go from being essentially, you know, individual postdocs to, you know, projects like the one we've just seen. And so in terms of what we need to do over the next decade, there are some things already taking place. New projects are already appearing. Between submitting our application to the decade and hearing, we already acquired, I think, at least 4, if not 5 more projects within JETZON. And new collaborations are already emerging. We've got quite a few things have popped up since the Biarritz workshop just a couple of years ago, which is where JETZON started. There are some things where we need more work though. And so one of the things that we want to do over the coming years are identify the big gaps in our understanding of the twilight zone. There are some very large gaps in our geographical coverage. And so we need to think about how we can address that. We need to engage more with stakeholders in terms of talking to the people who also have interests in the twilight zone. And as part of the development, we also need to be bringing on the early career ocean professionals. And, you know, in a very simplistic way, those are people who were going to be the professors in 10 years' time when the decade closes. And so, you know, we need to make sure that we bring those through. And we also need to be thinking about how we communicate the importance of the twilight zone to the general public. In terms of new things, JETZON is going to need a little bit more structure in order to achieve this. So there will be a steering committee set up. That clearly needs to be broad, and so that's currently under construction. I'm still waiting to hear from a few people in terms of whether they'll be involved. We'll also set up a project group, and so this will be a way that people from the various projects within JETZON can get together informally to discuss, you know, collaborations, sharing data, these sorts of things. And then the other thing is back to the early career ocean professionals. One of the things we'd like to think about is actually having some sort of forum. And the question there is what would work best for those people. And I just want to flag, very pleased to say that Kelsey Bisson has accepted the role as the representative for JETZON in terms of the early career ocean professionals. So, cut to the chase. JETZON gets no money for becoming an Ocean Decade programme, I'm afraid. So one of the obvious things that we're going to have to tackle over the coming years is how we sustain ourselves through the decade with no direct funding. The Decade has set up something called the Ocean Decade Alliance, which is essentially a group of benefactors in some sense. But there's no guarantee of how the money will flow out of there, and it may turn out that we are not successful in getting much or indeed any of that. So we do need to be thinking about how we fund ourselves over the course of the next 10 years. And the other obvious bottom line to this is JETZON receives no funding, therefore it can award no funding. And so any projects involved in JETZON do need to be able to fund themselves. The question that you might have is, how will new projects link to JETZON? So it is hoped that projects within the programs will themselves receive endorsement as United Nations Ocean Decade projects. So what will happen, as I understand it, is that the Ocean Decade will issue a call specifically for projects to link to JETZON. Once again, that will involve no funding. That will just be an encouragement to go and write a proposal that can sit within JETZON. The mechanism by which those projects are approved is still being finalized. So I can't really give you much more detail on that, I'm afraid. So the thing I want to flag now, so it doesn't come as a surprise later, one of the questions that we got asked when we put in our application was how we're going to sustain ourselves in terms of delivering the things that we might want to do. And so it will be a condition for a new project getting involved in JETZON that it provides something to the wider aims of JETZON. And so that might be, for example, running a workshop which is available to people outside the project. It might be making berths available to people outside the project. All things are considered, but the expectation will scale with the size of the project. For those of you with projects already running inside JETZON, an obvious question you might have will be, well, what happens to our project? Do we get the Ocean Decade badge? I've had this discussion with the IOC, and it is inevitable that there will have to be some sort of application, even for existing projects, to be designated as Ocean Decade projects. I am hoping that it can be made a lighter touch. I've stressed the fact that the projects currently involved are effectively the reason why JETZON is here, and as a result they should be treated as such, but those discussions are still ongoing, and I'll get you more information on that as and when I can get the answers to it. And so the last one then really is just a request. I think in order to make JETZON sustainable, we need to run it in a distributed way as far as possible. So that means keeping the central functions to a minimum and generating a lot of our activities through the projects within JETZON. So this gives us more flexibility, clearly, and hopefully it helps sustain us a little easier. But the obvious flip to that is that it's only going to work if people get involved, if people writing proposals, writing activities for JETZON as part of those proposals. So just to finish off, please do get involved. JETZON, that is a bit of a cliche, but it is true. JETZON will be what you make it, in the sense that if we don't individually bring something to JETZON, then it will not survive the decade. It won't do what we want it to. And that is it. So if I stop sharing that, I'm happy to take any questions that people might have on that. How's the chat? Will we still? Oh, the chat is still trading numbers of snow catchers and quarantine days, I see. So does anybody have any questions about the decade? Joanne.
Hey, Adrian. Hi, everybody. I was wondering, for instance, for the outreach activities or stakeholders engagement, if any project of JETZON is doing some outreach activity, can we count this as a JETZON outreach activity? I'm not sure it makes sense to do outreach activities only for JETZON when there's already outreach going on inside this project. It's probably related to the fact that if these projects are endorsed or not, but
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the outreach, like the activities like workshops and things, are largely going to be delivered through individual projects. We will try and keep track of things and choreograph them from sort of the people involved in terms of managing JETZON, but inevitably the majority of the outreach, the communication will be done by existing projects. And so, the obvious project, which is doing a fantastic job on this already, is the Ocean Twilight Zone at HUI. Anybody who hasn't looked at their web pages, I strongly encourage you to do so, because some of the outreach they're doing is fantastic. And in the eyes of the United Nations, all of that counts as contributing to JETZON as a program. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can make use of the resources within the project.
That makes sense. Thank you.
That's right. Any more questions out there about the decade?
Yeah, Adrian, hi, it's Dave. Just a question about who the stakeholders are. I know when we formed, it was more thinking about what the impacts would be on large scale fishing and those sort of extractive things. But from my purview, there's some other moving needles here that will impact the ecology and functioning, the biogeochemical functioning of the Twilight Zone that I think we should talk more about. One of which, and we've brought in the deep sea mining issue and what happens to the tailings, but the other one really is this ocean carbon dioxide removal strategies.
Yeah.
And these are and people are actually talking about doing these things, and these are hundreds of billions of dollars worth of things that have to get put in place if we are going to somehow use the oceans to remove petagrams of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So, and there's lots of strategies, and some of them are better than others in terms of what happens to the Twilight Zone. So it does seem that there's a stakeholder group that we could get our hands around a little bit better, that is a little bit more, I don't know if you realize, but things have kind of changed in the United States since January. It's sunnier here. It's more optimistic. We're thinking of the future. But I do think that this ocean CDR thing is getting a lot of attention. There's people talking about growing massive amounts of macrophytes and dumping them deep in the ocean without thinking about what it could possibly do to that. So there's ways that we can use our science to help inform those policy-related processes better. That's all I mean to say.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, I have been doing a little bit of work in terms of trying to get people from some of these groups. So the carbon dioxide removal, I haven't tried yet, though that is on my list, because I had a quick look at the, I think it was CDR Net, which is CDR Ocean Net, which is one of the, I think there were many 4 which have sprung up. And just looking at their front page, 4 of the 8 mechanisms they talk about would have a direct impact on the Twilight Zone. So it's clearly something we need to, to draw in. The difficulty I'm having, and this is where I would welcome input from anybody, is finding somebody within those stakeholder groups who is willing to, for example, sit on the steering committee of JETZON and be willing to sit there and talk to people openly about these sorts of activities. So far, I have been unsuccessful in the fishing community. I found it very difficult to find anybody there. And I haven't been terribly successful in deep sea mining either. I was hoping that when we got the endorsement by the UN as a program, that this is going to make it a little easier, in the sense of, there are probably people with a lot of demands on their time. They can't say yes to every committee, but if they see that something now has the backing of the Ocean Decade, then they might hopefully be more minded to get involved. But any contacts that people have got that they can lean on to get people from these sectors involved, I agree, because, I think if we just run JETZON as purely scientists talking to each other for 10 years, we're ultimately going to do a lot of great science, but we're unlikely to have much of an impact in terms of how the twilight zone is treated. So if I say, if anybody does have any contacts in those sectors, then please do let me know. Are there any other comments or questions? Let me see. No. So no, I haven't, Carol. So so that is one of the other programs, I think. Is that right, Carol?
Yes, that's correct.
Right. So this brings me on to one of the sort of the complexities of the decade, which I've had some discussion with IOC about. One of the potential dangers is that the same people within these organizations gets approached by a large number of programs. And so one of the things which the decade is considering is having groups which effectively run across programs, which will allow sort of discussions, for example, on deep sea mining or CDR to take place. At the moment, I think they're still thinking through how to do that. So I think in the short term, if we talk to GEOS, then that would probably be a good thing if they've already managed to make contacts in that direction. So Carol, can you, I don't know if it's in the chat already, but do you have a contact there that I could approach? Maybe you could email me or put it in the chat. Something else to be aware of is that we are likely to have opportunities put in front of us at fairly short notice by the decade, encouraging us to get involved as a program. So one of the things running in parallel is that the decade has a number of themes which it will be pushing over the course of the decade. And it will be running things which it calls laboratories associated with those themes. So a decade laboratory, at least in its first instance, is a 48-hour period where there is a plenary for about 3 or 4 hours, and then a whole host of satellite activities take place around it over the course of 48 hours on a particular theme. The reason I mention this is because they have announced one to do with the predicted ocean. So this is how we model the ocean. And I think it's the 15th and 16th of September, or give or take a day or two. And we have been invited to suggest something as a satellite activity to the predicted ocean for that event. The downside is that we have until Friday to come up with the idea. And so I've had some discussions with Joanne and Marty and Iris Christ. And so if you do have any things that you'd like to suggest that JETZON could put forward as a way of linking to how we model the ocean or how we go about modeling the ocean, the twilight zone, then please do either put it in the chat or contact Joanne or Marty or myself. Joanne, did you want to add anything else at all?
No, but just say that I've created the first draft of the idea we discussed, and so yeah, I mean, anybody who's interested and who's willing to contribute is fairly easy. It's pretty short, but it's nice if anybody else can join us for this week. So send me a mail or send a mail to Adrian, and we'll try to put together the submission form for Friday. Basically, the idea is to the only idea we got so far is to bring together modelers and to define some kind of protocol to decide if which is the level of complexity that biogeochemical models need. If we can agree this in the community, we think that it could be pretty useful. But yeah, so I mean, observational people is also very welcome, because this kind of related to which kind of parameters we can observe and how we transfer these parameters to the models. So please, if you have time, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Sorry, I'm just copying in the chat a link to the Ocean Labs, because it's a bit an abstract idea. So I know it really helped me to understand what what they're trying to do actually.